What a beautiful song. Thank you so much. It brought back lovely memories of my time as a child of the Sacred Heart in Dublin. Thank you, Duchesne Academy. I must say I'm delighted to be here with you this morning. I have felt very at home with ICAN from the moment that I arrived yesterday. And there's a great spirit, a great sense of community, which has already come out strongly this morning. And you're also a wonderful audience. I can't even see the end of the audience in the lighting, but it's a very special occasion in which to share some of my experience and hopefully help, as we heard a wonderful poetic encouragement at the start of this morning, help to make a difference and have you going away feeling that little bit different. But first, I think I have to start on a rather personal note. On those huge, rather intimidating screens, you can probably see that I have a little problem with my left hand. And it happened on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March. St. Patrick's Day was actually quite an exciting day because I was in South Africa, partly for work and partly for a family wedding. And the last bit of work, but it wasn't really work, was a ceremony in Cape Town where the Irish ambassador asked me and a former minister in President Nelson Mandela's government, who also happened to have taught me law in Dublin, Professor Kader Asmal, we were both asked to flick two switches together, and this would result in the greening of Table Mountain. Any of you who know Cape Town know that Table Mountain is the iconic mountain. So we flicked the switches, and we looked out from our hotel, and these soft laser lights lit up Table Mountain in a gentle, beautiful green that made me feel very proud. And then I went to a family reception before a family wedding, and I met my 6-year-old granddaughter and her 7-year-old brother. Her brother wasn't very interested. He said hello to Granny, and then he went on playing with this toy. But my granddaughter wanted me to look at her dress and her shoes, and Granny was so busy doing this that I didn't notice a little step behind me. And the two of us fell, and my granddaughter thought it was very funny, and so did I, until I realized it wasn't quite so funny. So you just never know in life. But let me come back to why I really feel at home with ICAN. It's because of the way it was conceived. As some of you told me last night, it was conceived at Portland Airport 31 years ago and worked up around a kitchen table by a group of pioneers. And I met some of them last night, so I would like personally to begin by saluting Gail Browning, Fran Root, Tim Rouse, Carol Hunter, and I'm sure many more colleagues. They saw a gap and an opportunity. And they were flexible, I'm told, because 30 years ago, the men also wanted to be involved. So that's how ICAN began. And then 18 years ago, as we've heard, they formed this Women's Leadership Initiative. And this is carried on now brilliantly, I think, by Mary Prefontaine and her team, some of whom we've heard this morning. It's a real strength here in Omaha, here in Nebraska, that something begun quite modestly by a few individuals has grown and developed and really served the community here. So let me draw a little bit on my personal experience and focus on gaps and opportunities that give some insight from my own life, which I hope will encourage some of you to really develop that potential which is there. First of all, and this I want to particularly say to the girls and boys from the Duchesne Academy, it wasn't at all likely that I would have the kind of life that I have had. I grew up in the west of Ireland, the child of 2 doctors, 2 physicians. I was wedged between 4 brothers, 2 older than me and 2 younger. So of course I had to be interested in human rights and equality and making sure that I could speak up in front of these brothers. And fortunately, our parents decided to really ensure that we understood what equality means in the family as well as in the wider life. And my brothers did as much of the chores at home as I did. In fact, they felt they did more of the dishwashing and bringing out the dustbins and so on. But it was an important lesson that we will not have full equality unless boys, when they're growing up, do the same kind of chores at home as their sisters. And that's something that we still have to work at. I decided to study law and was very fortunate to get a fellowship to the Harvard Law School, which did have a huge impact on my life. I was there in the late 60s. I'm the class of 1968. And it was an incredible time in this country. Young people were discussing, as was the wider community, what was regarded as an immoral war, the war in Vietnam. Many of my contemporaries in Harvard were going into the civil rights movement, were looking at issues of poverty and race in this country in a very challenging way for them. We're looking at the divides that had to be bridged in this country. And what I felt most of all was how young people at that time, my contemporaries in Harvard, were confident in a way that young people in Ireland weren't. We knew our place as young people in Ireland. These young people were saying, hey, we can make a difference, we can change things. And so when I went back to Ireland to start practicing law and teaching law as a tutor in one of the universities, I had a certain confidence. Mind you, some of my friends called it Harvard Law School arrogance, but whatever you call it, when there was an election the following year in Ireland, a parliamentary election, the lower house having been elected, then it was time for the elections to the Senate, which has 60 members. It's a mixed body, and 6 of those 60 are elected by the graduates of the 2 main university streams. And I was part of the Trinity College stream. And I posed the question, why is it that the graduates of the universities inevitably voted for elderly male professors? And having posed the question, my friend said, well, if you want to change things, why don't you go forward? We'll support you. And so I did go forward, having had no political background, and I had a wide number of friends, young and old, male and female, who rallied to the cause. And at the age of 25, I was elected to the Irish Senate, and elected with a sense of wanting to change things. And at that time, most of the change that we needed in Ireland was to open up from the Catholic-dominated country that we were, in our constitution and laws, to create space, particularly in the context of bringing about a peace process eventually with Northern Ireland, which is predominantly Protestant. And the first item that I chose to introduce a bill on, in fact, was to legalise family planning in Ireland. I was quite convinced of the merits of needing to do this because, as Shakespeare has put it so well, the law had become an ass. Married women could only avail of the contraceptive pill if they had cycle regulation problems. And it must have been the weather, but a very large number of married women had cycle regulation problems. And it was against the criminal law to buy or sell a condom, but it wasn't against the law to use a condom. So again, there was something that needed to be done. And I introduced a short bill with 2 male senators, colleagues, and it wasn't even printed. There was outrage. I was denounced from pulpits. How could somebody who was a Sacred Heart child do this? And, really a very difficult time. And being 26 at the time the bill was introduced, I wobbled. I was quite taken aback. And I learned a lesson because ultimately we introduced further measures and the bill was passed as a government bill about 9 years later. But I learned that if you really believe in something, you have to at times be prepared to take criticism, be prepared to be vilified even for principles that are important. But I also learned an even more important lesson for later life when I was working in human rights in the United Nations. And that is, very often deep changes that are cultural are not just about changing law. They're about changing from within. They're about changing an outlook and behavior. And that takes time. It takes a lot of discussion. And it's not something that you can just come as a Harvard graduate and slap in a bill and think it will happen. It was a lesson that I remembered well later in life. The idea of being nominated to run as President of Ireland was not my idea. The presidency in Ireland is very different from the United States or France or many of the presidencies in Africa and elsewhere, executive presidencies. In Ireland, it's a non-executive presidency, but it is elected by all of the people of Ireland. The Prime Minister, whom we call the Taoiseach, and his government have the political power. The President does have important powers under the Constitution to refer bills to the Supreme Court, to address both houses of the Parliament, etc. But the role is mainly one of representing Ireland abroad, of being the face of Ireland, if you like, and of being close to people internally. There had been 6 men presidents since Ireland got its independence in the 1930s, and all of them were elderly, and somehow there was a sense that this was a reward for previous service, and it was so important that very little was done by the president except ceremonial occasions. So I had not been particularly interested. But when I was approached to go forward on behalf of the smallest party that could nominate, the Labour Party, the other 2 big parties were also going to nominate, I went back to the Constitution and looked at it. And I thought to myself, well, I'm not going to get elected because that's a step too far. But there's far more that could be done from this office of president for a modern Ireland in 1990, which is seeing so much change, which has become part of the European Union, etc. So I agreed to be a candidate, more, I have to say, to advocate and make the case. And the Irish bookmakers made it very clear what my chances were, because they posted 100 to 1 against being elected. Unfortunately, I didn't put any money on, which was foolish. But the campaign was a wonderful time for me of getting to know my country. And one of the things that I found particularly moving and compelling was the amount of community self-development that was going on in inner cities, in towns, in villages, in parishes. Ireland had become a little better off because of the European Union and the Common Agricultural Policy, but many towns and cities and inner cities and villages lacked facilities for the elderly, for young people, sports facilities, opportunities for the elderly to be properly cared for and given opportunities to continue to have a very active life. And it was the local community that was doing it. We even had a Gaelic word that expressed this. The word is mehel, the spirit of mehel. And it's a word which is not easy or impossible, really, to translate into English. It means connected with the other. The nearest I have found to it is the Ubuntu principles in Africa, that sense of solidarity, that sense of community together. We are stronger. I am because you are. We are stronger together, that spirit of mehel. And after an incredible campaign during 1990, against the odds and in a wonderful way, I was elected. And in my acceptance speech, I did pay tribute to the women of Ireland, Manon na Heron, as we would say in Irish, who had broken from family tradition in order to ensure that I would be elected. And I met one of them about 2 years ago in Boise, Idaho. I was speaking to an audience not as large as this, but again, I think on women's leadership. And at the end of it, a young woman came strode towards me looking rather purposeful with her hand out. And she said, "I'm Irish," she said. "I want to shake your hand. You were my first vote at the age of 19. And when I told my father, he nearly killed me." So that explained what happened. And having been elected, the challenge was to find a new way of ensuring that the presidency would be both more proactive and closer to those very people who had been involved at local level in self-development. And I learned the power of symbols. Symbols are very powerful in the way that poetry is, the way we were touched this morning by the words of the poet. At that first speech on the night of the election, I said that I would put a light in the window of the official residence, Oras on Uachtaráin, for all of those who'd had to emigrate from Ireland. I said that in the passion of the moment. I completely underestimated how powerful that light would be, that it would connect the huge Irish diaspora everywhere in the world, here in Nebraska, here in Omaha, but everywhere, with the modern Ireland that was reaching out in a way that really meant so much to Irish immigrants, to those who longed for that connection. And it was a lesson again in the power of an idea, the power of that kind of linkage. Equally, I reached out in friendship to the communities in Northern Ireland who were working in difficult circumstances to bring about local reconciliation. The brave Republican Catholic women who came out of their housing estates, the brave Protestant loyalist women who came out of their housing estates and met. And sometimes it was women who were giving that kind of leadership. And I could really sense that there was an opportunity for a moral leadership which wasn't based on political power, but was based on relating to what was important in people's lives and trying to support what they were doing. Having served as President of Ireland, I had the honour to be appointed UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It sounds a very important title, and it is an important position. But when I moved to Geneva, I discovered that I had a very small office with a very large mandate and very few resources. So again, looking for the gap and the opportunity, I decided that one way in which I could try to serve as High Commissioner for Human Rights was to go to where the violations of human rights were taking place. And unfortunately, that was happening in all too many places, in parts of Africa, in Colombia, in Latin America at the time, and in Kosovo, when there was the conflict in Kosovo and refugees were streaming out to the neighboring countries. I remember being in Albania with my human rights colleagues, talking to these refugees, the families, about the violations that had occurred. And then one of my human rights colleagues said, perhaps you'd like to come round the corner to where there's a teacher teaching a class of students. And this was in the bleak refugee camp, which wasn't even a proper camp. It was a makeshift camp because it hadn't been properly built yet. And I went around the corner to a field where a young woman from Kosovo was teaching. And their children were sitting on the ground. They didn't have pencils or paper or anything. They were learning by rote, and she was teaching. And she saw us there, so after she finished with the students, she came and spoke to me. And she said, this is actually keeping me sane. I was a teacher before, and it's important to me that I continue to teach. And of course, these children must learn. And I feel I'm making a little difference. I'm doing something. And I, encouraged her and praised her for what she was doing. And then she said, would you do me a favor, she said. Would you come to where we're based in this camp and just meet my parents? They're quite elderly. And as we went, she told me the story of how their house had been burnt and her parents and herself had fled, and etc. And when we came to the parents, her mother was quite ill with diabetes. And she said to me, the worst thing in this camp is we're very, very far from the latrines. And at night, my mother doesn't always get there, and she feels so humiliated. And in a simple way, it brought home all of the suffering, all the lack of any kind of human dignity, all too often, of people where there are gross violations of human rights. And my task was to try to amplify those voices, to make the powers that be hear, and to hold governments accountable. And I learned that it's civil society groups who hold governments accountable. and hold them accountable for the commitments they've made under the human rights conventions and covenants. After that 5-year term as High Commissioner, as you heard, I formed a small initiative called Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative. Now, despite that long title, it also was formed round a kitchen table. I wanted to pioneer a doing to show that development, if it was linked to the human rights obligations that governments had voluntarily accepted, would make a difference. It would be a better quality. It would be more meaningful, whether it was in health, whether it was in women's empowerment and leadership, or, as we focused on quite a bit, corporate responsibility. I've learned that Omaha has a strong sense of pride, and indeed Nebraska, in corporate responsibility and corporate ethics. And a good deal of the work we were doing was in support of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Business and Human Rights, Professor John Ruggie, who's based in Harvard. I'm not going to go on at length about what he has done. He has framed a new way of looking at the responsibility of corporations and governments in human rights. So those of you who are interested, just Google John Ruggie, Business and Human Rights, and you'll see that this June, the Human Rights Council will adopt his guidelines to guide business in their responsibility on human rights. And that was a classic case of John Ruggie and his team, and support from Realizing Rights and others, understood that there was a gap, a lack of understanding of what was the proper responsibility of governments, the main responsibility to protect and promote human rights, and for corporations particularly working in developing countries with weak government or bad government, what was their responsibility? And he has clarified that gap. The last area of development that I wanted to speak about is the work that I now do. And it grew out of seeing a different phenomenon impacting on the people that we were working with in Realizing Rights. We had focused on African countries, on right to health, on women's empowerment, on decent work in Liberia, in Ghana, in Sierra Leone, in Tanzania, Malawi. And I was learning Kenya, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Wherever I went in Africa and was with subsistence farmers, poor women, I realized they were talking more and more about the fact that the climate was changing, that there were no seasons. Perhaps the most compelling person to tell me that was my friend Constance Okellet from Uganda. Constance is a mother of 8. She grew up in a village in Uganda where they were quite well off. And when I say well off, nobody was rich, but nobody was starving. It was kind of a nice village life. And then, over a period of about 4 or 5 years, the weather patterns changed. And instead of having the seasons when they knew when to sow, they had flooding and then drought, and then flash flooding again that just ran off the dry land. The school was destroyed. And it was Constance and her women's group who came together to try to hold their community together in these circumstances. And she was, if you like, found by Oxfam International, which I'm honorary president of. Before the big climate meeting in Copenhagen, Oxfam was looking for climate witnesses, those who could speak about the impact on their community. And Constance came to Copenhagen, and I've met her a number of times since at conferences, and she's coming to Dublin soon at the invitation of my foundation. And the way she tells the story, she says, when this weather began to be so bad, and it wasn't in any of our experience, even our grandparents had never known anything like this, we thought that God was punishing us. And then I have learned through Oxfam and listening about the climate and the global warming and the emissions that it's not God who's punishing us. It's the lifestyles of rich people. And it's a very interesting way of putting it, that our overuse of carbon, our contribution to global warming is impacting on the climate. Take it from me, I don't need any scientific proof. I have the human proof from the evidence I've had in different African countries and the way I've been listening. And so I've established a new foundation on climate justice, looking at how we square that circle of justice and equity, that those least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, fossil fuel growth, are being affected. and it's undermining their poverty. It's undermining subsistence farmers and indigenous peoples. As you can tell, it too is a big human rights issue. And the only other hat that I wanted to touch on very briefly, because I wanted to link with the work of Nike, the Nike Foundation, and so many others on the girl effect, is the fact that I was invited to join this group of elders brought together by Nelson Mandela. We do look at situations of conflict worldwide, but we also decided that we should try as elders to think about the position of women and girls in our world, and how could we perhaps just make a statement, give some leadership on that issue. Now, we're elderly and we're few, so what would we do? The first thing we did was to issue a strong statement of concern about the way in which religion and tradition can be misused, abused, to undermine and subordinate women and girls, culturally and in communities, and that this has to be addressed not least by religious leaders and traditional chiefs in their areas. And from there we've moved to a concern about child marriage. You saw the clock ticking and the girl wanting to postpone the age of marriage. For millions of girls in the world today, they marry far too young and lose their childhood. So this is another area in which we are working, and in which I can very much link with what was said about the girl child and the potential of the girl child and the difference it makes if we ensure that the girl child is central to future development. So, as you can see, in many ways I've been very lucky, because I've seemed to move from one situation to another in a kind of seamless way. It's not as if it was planned so much as if it just comes out of the experience and the opportunities that I've had. So I'd like to end by borrowing the words and the concepts that were put to you at the beginning of this morning by Azur Antoinette. I liked the way she was reaching out as a poet. I think she's absolutely right. We don't link enough anymore in a really human way. I hope that what I've said helps you in some way, each of you, to be encouraged to know of your potential, and that I have recognized, as I do, that ICAN has forged a wonderful path here in Omaha, here in Nebraska. I love your values. I love the way that you have identified the importance of opportunities for training, opportunities for development of potential, but not in the abstract. Opportunities to develop potential for service here, for service in the United States, for service internationally. I loved that. Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations to ICAN. Thank you.